Picture opening your eyes to a world where the battles you fight each day, your fragile health, your shortness of breath, the constant haze in your mind, are not random misfortunes at all. Instead, they are the legacy of choices made long before your first cry. Imagine discovering that the reason your body falters isn't fate, but the deliberate will of rulers, obsessed with keeping their lineage untouched. Kings and queens who believed that bloodlines were more precious than lives condemned their daughters to inherit weakness and despair. Your mother might also be your aunt, your father, your cousin. Generations fold in on themselves until the family tree resembles not branches, but a suffocating knot. These women weren't born of devotion or affection. They were born as pawns in dynasties, desperate to clutch power at any cost. This isn't a storybook nightmare. It was the lived reality of some of history's most inbred women, trapped in cycles they never consented to, carrying the weight of a dynasty's curse in their very blood. And before we step into these hidden accounts of pain, betrayal, and survival, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more untold stories buried in the darker corners of history.
And I'd love for you to drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. It amazes me how people from all over the globe can come together here, united by the same hunger to uncover history's hidden truths. But to really grasp the tragedies of these women, we first need to step inside the warped mindset that produced them. For centuries, Europe's ruling houses were convinced that keeping marriage in the family was the key to preserving their throne. They believed their veins carried something mystical, blood set apart from ordinary people, blood sanctified by God. To them, mixing with outsiders was unthinkable. By the 1500s, this obsession had transformed the royal courts of Europe into a tangled knot of kinship, cousins wedding cousins, uncles taking their nieces, brothers fathering heirs with their sisters. What they couldn't see, blinded by arrogance and superstition, was the genetic catastrophe they were passing down like a crown of thorns. No dynasty embodied this downfall more than the Habsburgs of Austria and Spain. Their infamous creed might as well have been, "Let the world fight battles, we'll rule through marriages." But those unions weren't about love. They were political deals that bred weakness, deformity, and despair. Our first descent into this nightmare begins in Vienna, the year 1634. Deep inside the cold halls of the Hofburg Palace, a baby girl took her first breath already burdened with a curse in her DNA. Her name was Marie Anna of Austria, and her life would become a living testament to the dangers of a bloodline turned against itself. What happens when a family tree stops branching and begins looping in on itself? The result isn't a legacy of strength, it's a slow suffocation. By the time Marie Anna of Austria was born, the Habsburg dynasty had twisted its bloodlines so tightly that her body carried the weight of centuries of inbreeding. From her earliest years, she knew she wasn't like the other children. While courtyards echoed with laughter and running feet, Marie Anna moved with painful effort. Her spine bent unnaturally, forcing her chest inward and making every breath a labor. Her lower jaw jutted forward so drastically that chewing became a trial. Servants carved her meals into fragments so small a child could eat them, yet each bite was a careful, exhausting ritual of grinding and swallowing. But the cruelty of her condition wasn't only physical, it was psychological. The walls of the Hofburg Palace were lined with portraits of long-dead relatives, and in each painted face, Marie Anna saw herself. A cousin with the same jutting chin, a great-aunt with the same crooked back. Looking at them was like staring into a mirror of affliction, each generation passing the same deformities like cursed heirlooms. She came to a devastating realization. Her suffering wasn't random, she was simply the newest branch on a poisoned vine. The court doctors, bound by fear and tradition, never spoke the truth aloud. They muttered about mysterious illnesses, about God's will, about destiny, but never admitted the obvious. The whispers of a Habsburg curse followed her like a shadow. In reality, her pain was the cost of her parents' and grandparents' determination to keep their dynasty's blood pure. Isolated in darkened chambers, hidden away from curious eyes, Marie Anna retreated into books. Her body may have been frail, but her intellect burned bright. In stories, she discovered an alternate reality, one where love guided marriage, not politics, where children weren't born already burdened by their ancestors' mistakes. For her, these tales were not just escape, but rebellion,
proof that another world could exist beyond the suffocating grip of her family's choices. But reality was merciless. The palace doctors visited Maria Anna frequently, treating her less like a daughter of emperors and more like a specimen under glass. They charted the angle of her twisted spine, the jut of her jaw, the frailty in her legs, reducing her to a list of defects rather than acknowledging her humanity. Each examination stripped away another layer of dignity. Isolation gnawed at her spirit more deeply than the physical pain ever could. Suitors, nearly all of them her own relatives, turned away after a single glance. Marriage contracts dissolved before the ink was dry, her visible deformities outweighing the political value of any alliance. Even in a dynasty where cousin unions were commonplace, Maria Anna's body bore too much evidence of degeneration to ignore.
Her life was brief and burdened.
At only 32 years old, her body finally yielded to the damage encoded in her blood. Official records blamed vague illnesses, but the truth was undeniable. She died not of disease, but of ancestry. Her fate was sealed by generations who valued dynastic pride above compassion, power above human life. From Vienna, the thread of this story winds south to Spain, where another royal woman endured a tragedy of a different kind. Joanna of Castile, remembered in history as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Born in 1479 to Ferdinand and Isabella, the same monarchs who expelled Jews and Muslims from Spain and bankrolled Columbus's voyages, Joanna entered the world with the weight of empire already on her shoulders. As a child, she showed no sign of instability. On the contrary, she was brilliant, fluent in several languages, educated in philosophy, theology, and music. Yet, beneath her polished surface, the curse of inbreeding lurked. Her parents, like so many crowned heads of Europe, were themselves close kin, part of the same tangled web of alliances and cousin marriages. The first cracks in Joanna's mind appeared after her arranged marriage to Philip of Burgundy, known as Philip the Handsome. The match was meant to cement political ties, but instead it became her undoing. Philip was arrogant, unfaithful, and cold. Joanna responded not with indifference, but with a desperate, consuming attachment. What outsiders dismissed as madness may have been something else entirely. The anguish of a woman trained to believe her worth was bound to her husband's loyalty and her ability to bear heirs, yet trapped in a marriage that humiliated her at every turn.
Her descent accelerated when Philip died suddenly in 1506.
Joanna's grief twisted into obsession. She refused to let his body rest, transporting his coffin across Spain as though love could outlast death. Witnesses whispered of her opening the casket again and again, pressing her lips to the decaying face of the man who had betrayed her in life. To them, she was insane. To us, she is something more tragic. The embodiment of how dynastic pride and genetic entrapment shattered not just bodies, but minds. The picture of Joanna's life in her final years is disturbing, but it reveals more than mere eccentricity. It shows the crushing reality of her existence. Stripped of affection, stripped of dignity, she clung to the only connection she had ever truly known, even when that bond was poisoned. Her father, Ferdinand, and later her powerful son, Charles V, wielded her insanity as a weapon. By branding her unfit, they justified taking her crown and confining her for life. For nearly half a century, 46 long years, Joanna was held behind stone walls at the convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. The place was less a sanctuary than a dungeon. Damp, freezing chambers became her home. Meals were sparse, hygiene non-existent. Attendants recorded grim scenes. Joanna refusing to wash for weeks, shredding her garments in fits of despair, crying out through the night until her voice broke. But one question refuses to die. Was she truly insane? Or was her supposed madness the convenient invention of men who feared a woman's authority? Today, many historians argue the latter. Her breakdowns, though severe, bear the hallmarks of what we would now recognize as profound depression, relentless anxiety, and post-traumatic trauma, all magnified by decades of forced solitude.
Still, the shadow of bloodline cannot be ignored. Joanna's ancestry was steeped in intermarriage, and the marks of hereditary instability appeared again and again. Her great-grandmother had endured similar mental torment. Generations later, her daughter Catherine would suffer from crushing depression. The pattern was undeniable, yet no one at the time dared connect it to the Habsburgs' obsession with marrying their own. Joanna's story ended in silence. She died in 1555, still locked away, still carrying the official label of Mad Queen. Spain barely took notice. She had been erased long before her body gave out, remembered not as a ruler wronged by her family, but as a convenient scapegoat. But history's cruelty did not stop with Joanna. Our journey now moves into the glittering but decaying Spanish court of the mid-17th century, where a child princess named Margaret Theresa bore the crushing weight of empire in a body already weakened by generations of inbreeding. Born in 1651 to Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria, her life would become yet another tragic chapter in this dynasty's self-inflicted curse. By the mid-1600s, the Habsburg dynasty had twisted its family tree so severely that uncles marrying nieces was treated as ordinary politics rather than scandal. Into this world was born Margaret Theresa of Spain, her entire life captured in painstaking detail on the canvases of Diego Velázquez, the king's loyal painter. Those portraits, celebrated as masterpieces, also serve as a haunting record. They show a child who should have been running through courtyards or laughing with playmates, instead locked in heavy brocade gowns, jewels weighing down her tiny frame. Her round face already hinted at the genetic curse. A jaw just slightly too prominent, a gaze that seemed distant, posture stiff in a way that foretold spinal trouble. Velázquez never exaggerated these flaws, but neither could he conceal them. The truth lingered in the brushstrokes. Yet Margaret Theresa's greatest misfortune wasn't what her body carried. It was the fact that her life never belonged to her at all. From the moment she could walk, her future was decided. She would marry her uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. The arrangement was sealed before she could even form complete sentences. To diplomats, it was a triumph. To the child herself, it was a prison sentence disguised as a wedding vow. Her upbringing reflected that destiny. Tutors filled her days with music, languages, and courtly manners. Every accomplishment, every note she played on the harpsichord, every line of Latin she recited, was never for her own enrichment. It was training to make her more valuable to the uncle who was both her fiancé and her guardian.
In 1666, the bargain became reality. Margaret Theresa, barely 15, was paraded before Europe in a spectacle of power. Leopold, nearly twice her age and her father's brother, claimed her hand. While courtiers applauded and fireworks lit the sky, the girl herself stepped into a role she could never escape. Behind the celebrations lurked a harsher truth. She was immediately expected to bear children, to carry forward a dynasty already collapsing under the weight of its own blood. Contemporary notes from physicians and attendants describe her fragile health, her body strained by pregnancies almost as soon as she entered womanhood. For Margaret Theresa, marriage was not a partnership, it was a duty carved into her flesh. For the Habsburgs, the weight of an empire rested squarely on Margaret Theresa's frail shoulders. Her sole purpose was clear: produce heirs. And though she did conceive several times, fate answered with heartbreak. Her first daughter survived only a handful of months before fading away. A second attempt ended before the child could even be born. When at last a son lived beyond infancy, celebrations rang out across Europe, only for it to become painfully obvious that he carried the same debilitating genetic burdens that haunted the dynasty. Each pregnancy hollowed Margaret Theresa further. What today's physicians would recognize as chronic anemia, respiratory weakness, and even epileptic seizures plagued her young body. She grew paler, thinner, her energy slipping away with each year. Attendants recorded her struggles with chilling detachment, her slurred words, her frequent collapses, her inability to keep food in her stomach. Yet none dared speak the truth aloud. She was a living sacrifice to centuries of bloodlines tangled beyond repair. In 1673, at only 21 years old, Margaret Theresa's body finally yielded. The official account blamed a fever. The reality was far crueler. Her health had been slowly dismantled by relentless pregnancies and the genetic curse she had no power to escape. Mourning swept the royal courts, but their grief was for the dynasty, not for the young woman herself. Diplomats wept over lost succession plans, not over the extinguished life of a girl who had been denied her childhood, her freedom, and ultimately her future. From the candlelit halls of Madrid, our journey now crosses into the glittering world of Versailles. There, beneath the golden ceilings and endless pageantry, another Habsburg daughter, Anne of Austria, would carry the same invisible chains, her fate shaped by the very blood that was supposed to guarantee her family's greatness. Anne of Austria entered the world in 1601, the child of Philip III of Spain and his niece Margaret of Austria, yet another union of uncle and niece, celebrated by Europe's rulers as a mark of dynastic strength, but in truth, a slow erosion of health. From her earliest years in Madrid, Anna lagged behind her peers. She struggled with learning, her jaw jutted forward in the unmistakable Habsburg profile, and every meal became a weary ritual of slow chewing and discomfort. More troubling still were the shadows over her mind, what today we would call anxiety and deep depression, gnawing at her even in childhood. At 14, Anna's life was uprooted. In 1615, she was married off to Louis XIII of France, a teenager torn from her home to secure a fragile peace between two warring kingdoms. Versailles welcomed her with fireworks and triumphal processions, but behind the gilded doors her new reality was bleak. Louis was remote, emotionally absent, and consumed by his own struggles. Historians now suspect he wrestled with crushing melancholy and desires that could never be spoken aloud in that era. To Anna, he was not a partner but a stranger she was forced to share her life with. Her duty was clear: bear sons to secure the French crown. But Anna carried the poisoned legacy of generations of inbreeding. Miscarriage followed miscarriage. Infants were born only to die within days. Each failure drove her deeper into despair. Yet instead of comfort, she was met with cruelty. Physicians of the French court cut her veins in endless bloodlettings, forced her through purges, dictated bizarre diets, and violated her privacy under the guise of medical examination. To them, the blame always rested with her, never with the broken bloodline that had shaped her body long before she was born. As the years passed, her childlessness became a weapon in court politics. Whispers spread like wildfire. Anna was cursed. Spain had brought bad fortune into France. Perhaps even God himself had turned his face away. For a queen already trapped in loneliness, the weight of gossip and humiliation was as heavy as her private grief. The relentless expectations crushed Anna until her very mind began to fracture. What today we would call agoraphobia slowly took hold. She dreaded appearing before the public eye, retreating deeper into the safety of her private chambers. Days, sometimes weeks, passed with her hidden away from the glittering world of court life. Her bond with Louis XIII, already fragile, collapsed entirely. Husband and wife became strangers under the same roof, meeting only when the rigid etiquette of monarchy forced them into the same room. In her isolation, Anna clung to faith with desperate intensity. Hours were spent kneeling before crucifixes, rosary beads worn thin in her hands, her devotion teetering on the edge of obsession. Then, in 1638, after more than 2 decades of humiliation, whispered gossip, and silent tears, the miracle came. Against all odds, Anna delivered a healthy son, the child who would grow into Louis XIV, the radiant Sun King. France erupted in celebration, convinced heaven itself had intervened. For Anna, the joy was bittersweet. She had proven her worth at last, yet that very proof shackled her to new anxieties. Would she be able to repeat the miracle? Could she sustain her fragile place in a world that only valued her ability to produce heirs? 2 years later, she bore another son, Philippe, securing the dynasty. The political relief was immense, but Anna herself remained a woman scarred by decades of psychological torment. Her body and mind bore the lasting marks of her ordeal. Chronic stomach troubles plagued her. Her breathing grew labored, and periods of crushing melancholy left her bedridden for days. Modern scholars reading the records of her physicians
see the clear outlines of anxiety disorders and hereditary depression, magnified by trauma and suffocating expectations.
In 1666, Anna's life came to its quiet end. She had outlived her cold husband and lived to see her son ascend as Europe's most powerful monarch. To the world, she was the Queen Mother of the Sun King. To history, she remains another tragic testament to the high cost of keeping bloodlines pure. Yet when we look back at her legacy, it isn't the glittering gowns, extravagant parties, or the politics of Versailles that speak loudest. What lingers is the toll of a dynasty that saw women as pawns in a genetic experiment to preserve power. Marie Antoinette is often remembered only for her downfall during the French Revolution, but beneath that story runs a darker thread. She too carried the echoes of the Habsburg curse. Born in 1755, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor, Marie entered the world already burdened by generations of intermarriage. While her parents were not as closely related as earlier unions, the Habsburg genetic legacy still lived in her blood. At just 14, she was sent to France to wed the Dauphin Louis XVI, expected to embody an alliance between two empires. Her painted likeness by artists such as Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun captures her beauty, but subtle signs remain visible: the slightly protruding lower lip, the faint shadow of the infamous Habsburg jawline etched by centuries of cousin marriages. What those portraits could not reveal were the invisible battles she fought. Like many Habsburg daughters before her, Marie endured painful, feminine ailments, irregular cycles, miscarriages, and hormonal imbalances that drained her strength. Her union with Louis XVI was fraught not only because of gossip, but because both partners carried their own genetic burdens. Louis himself struggled with awkwardness and developmental delays that made intimacy difficult, while Marie sank into periods of anxiety and despair that echoed the mental health struggles woven through her bloodline. For 7 years, the royal marriage remained unconsummated, a scandal whispered in every salon. Doctors poked and prodded Marie, searching for flaws in her body, never considering that the roots of the problem lay in the centuries of genetic entanglement behind them both. When at last she conceived, the ordeal was far from over. Severe nausea, nervous breakdowns, and what today would be called prenatal depression haunted her pregnancies. Her first child survived, but the losses that followed, miscarriages and infant deaths, shattered her spirit further. The tragedy of Marie Antoinette was not simply that she was a queen who misjudged her people, but that her fragile mental and physical state collided with a collapsing world. In another time, her mood swings and impulsive choices might have been overlooked as the temperament of a sensitive woman. In revolutionary France, they were weaponized as proof of cruelty and incompetence. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," though almost certainly never spoken by her, became a symbol of her supposed callousness. In truth, she was anything but indifferent. She was overwhelmed, unstable, and carrying the hidden weight of hereditary illness. Her downfall was written not only by political forces but also by biology. The French Revolution exposed her weaknesses for the world to judge, but behind the guillotine's blade was a young woman broken by centuries of dynastic obsession, sacrificed to keep a bloodline pure. She lived her final months consumed by torment, without the emotional strength to process the chaos around her. During her captivity and eventual trial, Marie Antoinette displayed moments of composure mixed with psychological collapse. Eyewitnesses remarked on spells of detachment, lapses in concentration, and long silences where she seemed to drift away from reality when the pressure became unbearable. Her death by guillotine in 1793 not only silenced a queen, but also closed a chapter on a dynasty defined by centuries of inbreeding. In those last moments, she carried herself with a grace that belied a lifetime of pain. A woman outwardly dignified but inwardly broken by forces she could never control. To fully grasp the depth of the Habsburg calamity, one cannot focus solely on individual queens or princesses, but must confront the generational devastation their marriages produced. Nowhere is this clearer than in the daughters and granddaughters of Spain's Charles II. This king, himself the product of relentless cousin marriages, embodied the collapse of a bloodline. Historians calculate that his genetic inbreeding level was higher than what would be expected from a child of siblings. The result was devastating: sterility, seizures, and cognitive decline.
But the true casualties were the women of his family, the Infantas, who were forced into dynastic marriages despite lives marked by deformity and disease. Maria Margherita, born in 1651, developed so slowly that she did not speak clearly until she was nearly 7. Her steps were unsteady, and her behavior reflected what modern medicine would likely classify as neurological and developmental disorders. Yet her royal title meant she was still paraded as a potential bride. Her sister Maria Theresa suffered a different set of afflictions. Chronic seizures, crippling lung problems, and a distorted jawline left her able to consume only soft foods. Severe scoliosis bent her body into positions that made sitting upright without aid nearly impossible. Inside the walls of the Alcazar of Madrid, the Spanish court resembled less a royal household than a clinic for the chronically ill. Surgeons, priests, and attendants moved constantly from chamber to chamber, treating children whose bodies bore the marks of hereditary ruin. The ledgers from this period read like a grim catalogue of genetic decline: convulsions, malformed bones, delayed development, fragile immunity, and psychiatric breakdowns. Despite all this, marriage contracts were negotiated with neighboring courts, each princess valued not for her well-being, but for her utility as a womb that might extend a dynasty, already poisoned by its own blood. In the end, Maria Margherita was married off to her cousin Leopold I, the same emperor who had previously taken her relative, Margaret Theresa, as his bride. Her fate was sealed not by choice, but by the relentless cycle of power, politics, and a family's refusal to let their tree grow beyond itself. The marriage was doomed from the start. Maria Margherita's delays meant she could never truly understand her role, while her frail health made even the basics of married life impossible. And she wasn't alone. Across generations, Habsburg women lived with the cruel paradox of being valued only for producing heirs, while knowing their damaged genes made healthy pregnancies nearly impossible. Court letters reveal the heartbreak in vivid detail. Miscarriages, infants who lived only days, children born with deformities too severe to survive. The emotional toll was crushing. Many of these women withdrew from public life, consumed by shame, depression, and the constant fear of another failed pregnancy. Without the science we have today, they blamed themselves, interpreting their suffering as personal weakness or divine punishment. Modern genetics explains what they could not. Centuries of cousin marriages exposed recessive defects that normally stay hidden. With each generation, disorders compounded: spinal deformities, infertility, seizures, depression, and the infamous Habsburg jaw. What the doctors of the time called mysterious illnesses were often the predictable result of inbreeding. Even as the evidence piled up, courts ignored the danger. Priests granted dispensations, physicians recorded symptoms as curiosities, and marriages between close kin continued in the name of politics. The women themselves, raised to believe their pure blood made them superior, often accepted the very system destroying them. The cycle ended with Charles II of Spain, too weak and sterile to produce an heir. His death in 1700 extinguished the Spanish Habsburg line, a dynasty undone by its own obsession with purity. For the women we've met, Maria Anna, Joanna, Margaret Theresa, Anne of Austria, Marie Antoinette, and the forgotten Infantas, the cost was their lives, their sanity, and their dignity. Their suffering wasn't the result of divine judgment, but of choices made in pursuit of power. Yet even in their pain they found resilience, through learning, through faith, through courage at the end. Their stories remind us that true nobility is not found in bloodlines, but in compassion, dignity, and the shared humanity their world denied them. These women's stories remind us of the hidden costs of power, tradition, and bloodline obsession. If you want to uncover more forgotten truths and the darkest corners of history, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next chapter in history's shadows.